Is it a matter of framing the problem, understanding exactly what your objective is, what you're really trying to accomplish?
Yes, that's actually a very key insight that you've just given. One of the things I think people do not do adequately well as individuals or as parts of organizations is to frame issues, problems, or opportunities well. And there are certainly many opportunities for people to do this just by stopping and saying, have I done it well? What could I do? There are opportunities to use these checklists to do that framing activity much more easily, much more effectively.
So one goal might be to make as much money as possible, but another goal might be to make customers as happy as possible. And if you do that, then you have a better chance of doing the first thing.
Yes, and there are no formulas. And in fact, I'm very happy with these checklists. I designed them to be situation neutral. And so excelling for some activities, let's say in one category of how we do things based on process or lack of process, could be appropriate in one category of behavior, could be appropriate for some things and not for others for a given situation. So certainly I really encourage people to use their judgment. That's the important thing, and not to look for complete routine solutions to getting to answers.
Now, I understand that not everything you've done here is in the private sector. You've also done some work with government agencies as well. Is that a lot different from the private sector?
I got that question actually in a different form when I joined PG&E because I'd come from a startup. And I got that question again when I joined the federal government because I left PG&E to serve as a politically appointed commissioner in the United States General Services Administration. And indeed, the roles that I had in leading a 2,000-person group included being co-CIO, Chief Information Officer, for the 4 million-person executive branch of the government. That was 100 of my people and 6 people in the Office of Management and Budget. I also led a $1 billion GSA business unit that sold computing and telecommunications related services to federal agencies, and there were some other parts to this job. And so people would ask me, is this different? Is this similar to what you've done before, as you've just asked? And the answer I actually have pulled into a principle which I advocate people use, and that is look for the similarities before you look for the differences. No matter what two things you're contrasting, you can always find differences. And if you stick with the differences, then you sort of wind up, people sort of wind up in this one is good except, and this one is good except, and then they're stuck. If you look for the similarities, you're going to be looking for commonality that both of those alternatives, or the many alternatives that you have, could serve. And with the similarities then, you have a framework that you can start with for evaluating whether it's even worth contrasting the differences or not. Maybe this isn't terribly significant after all, or if the differences are significant, you have a framework for evaluating which ones of those are most important.
There's some entities that are very resistant to change. They say, well, we've been doing it this way for a long time, it's worked for us, and we're comfortable, and change is uncomfortable.
I would say that as one looks at entities all the way from individuals to, in the case I had this wonderful opportunity to be really concerned about a 4 million person organization and at that time 250 million Americans and other people we served, you can find in any of those situations possibly very progressive work, outcomes and behavior, and very ossified practices at the same time. Certainly the federal government is no exception to that.
Now, Silicon Valley, where we are today, is a center of innovation. It's renowned over the world. Do you think the level of innovation is sufficient, or do you think that even here, the quality of innovation, the spirit of inventiveness can be improved so people can do even more with what they have?
I'm always an optimist on this, so I go for the either even more, or if you broaden that out, let's say more impactfully, even if it's the same thing that you would have been doing, more impact from it for customers, for shareholders, for yourself, for various other constituencies, if this is a business we're talking about, for your suppliers, for your partners, and so forth, even for the marketplace And just going back to a thing I mentioned earlier, while I was at PG&E, which is not particularly perceived of as an information technology supplier by any means, I pioneered a new business practice for the world software marketplace, and we got it to stick. Today it is known as the Corporate or Enterprise Software License, and it really did not exist before I got there. So this was a case of innovation outside of the scope of the mission of the company.
And PG&E is also very heavily regulated. So does that make it more difficult as far as what they can do?
I would suggest from that experience at PG&E and from my experience with the large group in the government, that actually some forms of regulation, some forms of bureaucracy can actually be an advantage. I was really sensitive to this at PG&E because in theory I regulated the use of all computing outside of mainframe computing and real-time power plant control type stuff throughout PG&E. I had that authority. And with the federal government, technically my group was regulating a good deal, some aspects of the use of computing, telecommunications, and information, by the way. That was a progressive step for much of the executive branch of the federal government. I look at regulation as an opportunity. In fact, I encourage my people in the government role there to look at their regulatory functions as a service function also. We have laws that are supposed to be complied with. We ourselves were putting out regulation for most of those 4 million people related to information technology procurement and other things related to that. So I encourage my regulatory functions, the people in them, to look at the regulation as a service, help people get through what they need to do to comply, also give them some consulting on good practices. So I wound up thinking about regulation, service, and then what in the political context would be called bully pulpit. I would have called it catalytic leadership. You can lead by what you say and what you do.
Now, can people at all levels of an organization be innovators, or is that just for people at the higher levels?
Well, the example that I gave from PG&E, I cited that there were actually people with payroll title of clerk who came up with innovations, with ideas for innovation. We did require a very brief project plan, and it turned out that that was a really good move because that meant that that clerk was getting buy-in from people up the hierarchy in his or her own organization. We required an officer's signature. You here in this room have signed off on really meant that. And so that clerk, whom I'm thinking of, who happened to be in the materials department, needed the signature of the Vice President for General Services in order to get the technology that she, in this case, was requesting. So we used the bureaucracy to help her market her great idea and get buy-in, and if you want to, cover for it. So you use the circumstance for good things, even though you can see some overtones in the word like bureaucracy.
Does it take a culture of innovation where from the top down, everybody is encouraged to think, not simply blindly follow orders, but to, because some types of enterprises, you don't want people to think, like if you're just doing the same repetitive task all day long.
The PG&E case is a very interesting one because even though I had, within a few years, worked with all but one of the officers of the company on something individually, I never went to any of them and said, I want your sponsorship. We never quoted them in our newsletter that came out of my group, as far as I can remember. We built this as an organic grassroots movement. And to look at what happened actually a few years after what I just told you, that speech, I went to a brown bag lunch and somebody asked the CEO of the company, what do you think are the most important things going forward for PG&E? And I was stunned because the CEO went straight to information and information technology as a first theme to talk about. But we never actually asked for that kind of endorsement. So you don't actually have to have it. I'm living proof that you don't need it.